Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Martin, and my project is entitled Out of Sight, Out of Mind, A Neighborhood Perspective on Encampment Sweeps, and it was advised by Dr. Catherine Einstein, and it was completed through the honors thesis in the Department of Political Science. So first, before I get into it, I just wanted to clarify what an encampment sweep is. So the actual definition is the forced removal of homeless people and their property from a public area. So these encampment sweeps can be expensive. It has been found to not reduce homelessness, and it has minimal public support from constituents. However, last year, in a Supreme Court case, Grants Pass versus Oregon, it was found that encampment sweeps do not go against the Eighth Amendment. So the Eighth Amendment is just against punishments that are considered cruel and inhumane. So this just made it a lot easier for cities to enact these encampment sweeps and perform them, even though it has minimal public support and it's expensive and paid for by tax dollars. So there has been a lot of research on encampment sweeps themselves. They've, as I've said, have found that they do not work in reducing homelessness. They've also found that it negatively impacts unhoused communities, whether that's through mental health, loss of belongings, including identification, or a disconnect from resources and support. So taking this into consideration when I decided to do my research project, I wanted to really look more generally and more broad and consider how these encampment sweeps are infecting communities and neighborhoods as well, not just focusing on the unhoused communities, however, also having part of a focus. So with that in mind, I decided to have two research questions. The first one being, how do encampment sweeps at major encampment sites impact the surrounding community? And then vice versa, how do these neighborhood complaints and concerns influence encampment sweeps? So in order to do these or find answers to these two questions, I needed to select at least two American cities and do a comparative analysis. So I decided to choose Boston and Los Angeles for a variety of reasons. I decided to focus on two large encampment sites in both cities. In Boston, I focused on the intersection of Massachusetts Avenue and Melnia Cass Boulevard. And in Los Angeles, I focused on Central City East, which is also known commonly as Skid Row. But also, I decided to focus on Boston because they have an incredibly low rate of unsheltered, unhoused individuals. Unsheltered basically just means people who are in these encampment sites and don't have access to temporary or permanent shelter, whereas Los Angeles has the highest rate of unsheltered, unhoused individuals in the United States. Also, Boston does have quite a high availability of shelters and beds, although not adequate for the number of unhoused people they are trying to serve. It's much higher than many other cities, which is pretty common on the East Coast. And then Los Angeles has a very low level of amount of shelters for unsheltered, unhoused people. And then finally, Boston is a really unique city because of the right to shelter law. So the right to shelter law is legislation that allows pregnant people and unhoused families to have a guaranteed right to shelter, although there's tons of hardships and tons of paperwork that these people have to go through in order to get this right to shelter. This is a really unique legislation, and it's not found anywhere on the West Coast. It's only found on cities on the East Coast, like New York. And even there's different situations, and it makes it a pretty unique legislation. So Los Angeles does not have this at all, and anything similar to it, actually. So in order to find answers to my research questions, I had 3 steps in my methodology. The first one being a historical and a contextual analysis of Los Angeles and Boston. Thanks to funding from Kilachand and the political science department, I was able to visit Los Angeles to get a conceptual understanding of the layout and the zoning of Los Angeles, as well as Boston from living here. And then I also looked at a variety of public documents, including mayor statements, Board of Health meeting minutes, planning board meeting minutes, city council meeting minutes, and then I looked at 311 calls in both cities. So 311 calls is the non-emergency number. Anyone can call across the United States, and this is typically where people call to make complaints or have safety concerns about encampments or unhoused communities. And the 311 calls in the public documents were specifically from 2022 and 2023 in order to get like a post-COVID analysis and also to have a modern perspective. So this is what those meeting minutes looked like. I used key terms, including house, home, tent, camp, sweep, in order to find when mentions of homelessness or encampments were present and also the reactions to them. This is an example of the data sets that I used from 311 calls. So they had tons of really unique information that was super helpful in this analysis, including where the calls were taking place, when they were taking place, when they were responded to, and what the calls were about, which allowed me to narrow the data in order to only focus on calls about encampments. And then I plugged that into our analysis to make some visual graphs and maps as well. And then to get into some of my results, I want to start with the historical analysis and the meeting minutes. I'll start quickly with the historical analysis. So Los Angeles and Boston have incredibly different setups and histories when it comes to housing and unhoused communities. Los Angeles, specifically within Central City East, has a much longer history with that encampment site, whereas the intersection I focused on in Boston is relatively new compared to it. And also just generally the zoning is different in every city. As I said, like the West Coast has a lot of different shelter availability than the East Coast generally, and Los Angeles and Boston are no different when they vary. And then, however, with those differences, I found the same issue of just not enough adequate housing and not enough affordable housing. California and Massachusetts are two of the highest rates of housing costs, as well as a really increasing unhoused population. And then in regards to the meeting minutes, a huge theme I found was that a lot of legislators and constituents and neighbors surrounding these sites had a super empathetic tone. So a lot of people were considering encampments and also the well-being and the safety of the unhoused communities themselves. However, there was a lack of action. There wasn't a straightforward pathway into dealing with encampments, encampment sites, or even just focusing on improving the area or the health around it, anything like that. There was just the mention of it, and it was kind of left behind with no legislation or steps being taken. And then here's some 311 analysis. A big thing I did was I looked at the geographic location of the 311 calls before and after major encampment sweeps. So here the blue dots are representing before a major encampment sweep in Los Angeles, and then the yellow dots are after. So in this example, you can see an increase of encampment or 311 calls about encampments to the northwest of Los Angeles, and that red area is where Central City East is. And then I also looked at the frequency of 311 calls generally. You have to take into account that Los Angeles is about 10 times larger than Boston when you look at this graph. However, on the x-axis, you can see the months, and then the y-axis is the number of calls regarding homelessness or encampments. And for both of them, I actually saw an increase in the warmer months around August. You can see the peak for both. And I attributed that to weather and temperature differences and actually the encampments on unhoused communities being more visible to 311 callers. And then for some main takeaways, first of all, I actually found that neighborhood complaints and encampment sweeps are largely consistent. They don't really relate to one another, so these 311 calls are not causing more encampment sweeps to occur, and encampment sweeps occurring are not causing more 311 calls or safety concerns. However, I did see a geographical disbursement of 311 calls after encampment sweeps. And then I really wanted to stress the similarities of each city and how they have legislation regarding encampment sites and encampment sweeps, regardless of different resources like to right to shelter law or more access to shelters or just different setups and different histories regarding housing. And then I did want to leave you all with a small call to action. As I said with the meeting minutes, there was a lack of coherent policy regarding new steps to take or new strategies to take other than these encampment sweeps, which have been found to be ineffective and costly, especially for taxpayers. And they're not popular with these taxpayers or the constituents who are voting legislators in who are deciding on these encampment sweeps. So I think there's a huge need to implement these coherent homelessness policy and action plans in order to best serve our communities and also the neighborhoods surrounding these unhoused communities. And finally, I just wanted to thank everyone who supported me throughout this process, and thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. I'm wondering if you actually went into these communities, and did that affect the research, or can you speak a little bit to that if that was an experience you had?
Yeah, so I actually began this project because I worked with Action for Boston Community Development Housing and Homelessness Prevention Department. I know it's a mouthful, but they actually inspired me to do this work where I worked with the mobile homeless outreach team in the Malden area. So I went out into these unhoused communities to give resources like water bottles or just like food and resources and things like that. So I did see it in Boston, and when I traveled to Los Angeles with the help of the political science department, I was staying in downtown Los Angeles. So I did see the communities. I didn't enter Central City East, but I was around the area, and I was talking to people that way.
You talked about visiting Boston and LA, but do you know how encampment sweeps might look differently in other cities around the nation?
Yeah, I do. So I didn't get a chance to talk about this, but basically encampment sweeps can look really different depending on the city you're in. So sometimes they alert unhoused communities that the sweeps will happen. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they connect them with resources and support afterwards, and sometimes they don't. There's no like real legislative action and like specifically how you do it, which is also another issue with these encampment sweeps.
So it seems really clear that encampment sweeps don't work. What would you encourage as some basic, effective policy?
Yeah, based on my research, I would advise communication with unhoused communities. I think a big issue with encampment sweeps is they're trying to remove people from visibility. That's why my presentation is entitled Out of Sight, Out of Mind. I think having those connections and building that communication between unhoused communities and support such as shelters or nonprofits like ABCD is a huge step that we can take rather than just pushing people away.
Anyone else?
And I just wanted to say thank you for doing this. As somebody whose office is right at the corner of Molina Cass and Mass Ave, it's so great that a student at BU cares about this community and wants to spend time and think about folks who have nothing. And yeah, I'm just really proud of you. So thank you.
Thank you.